The brightly lit dining room of a luxury New York restaurant was filled with haughty glances, forced laughter, and glasses clinking like symbols of power. It was into this setting that she entered, with timid steps, wearing a simple dress and carrying a baby. The silence that followed was not one of admiration, but of collective contempt. Some women whispered, laughing at the audacity of someone so out of place sitting among them. A waiter hesitated before serving her, as if her presence were a mistake. The cold gaze of the millionaire at the head table swept the room until he found her. He raised an eyebrow, curious and at the same time impatient, while a group of guests murmured, "How embarrassing, bringing a child to this place." She clutched her son to her chest, her face flushed with embarrassment, but her eyes, silently steady, seemed to carry a secret that no one there could decipher. Just as the criticism seemed to be suffocating her, something changed. The millionaire, previously indifferent, stood up and crossed the room toward her. The murmur grew as if everyone expected him to dismiss her with a cutting word. But as he approached, he stopped, looked directly at the baby, and then at her, and his hardened expression gave way to a shadow of recognition. It was as if he had seen a ghost from the past that hurt him more than any public humiliation could. The atmosphere in the restaurant transformed into an almost palpable tension. No one understood the silence. That fell over him, nor the reason why his hands trembled slightly. Only she knew the truth. And in that moment, the logic of the entire social game reversed, making it clear that the one who seemed fragile was, in fact, the most powerful player that night. If this story has already touched you, please like and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Winter in New York brought a chilly air that contrasted with the stifling heat inside the luxurious restaurant. The walls were covered in modern artwork, soft lights reflected in the crystal of the glasses, and every detail seemed carefully calculated to convey power, wealth, and exclusivity. Between men in tailored suits and women in dresses that sparkled like living jewels, the atmosphere was one of quiet superiority, almost cruel. It was the kind of place where the breath of someone out of place seemed too loud, where a glance lingered longer than warranted, and where any social error became a spectacle for the hidden delight of those present. It was into this scene that she entered. The contrast was almost cinematic. A young woman with a tired yet beautiful face, her hair hastily pinned up, and a simple dress marked by time and the excessive care of someone who couldn't afford to buy another. In her arms a baby slept peacefully, oblivious to the judgment already beginning to form around her. The clicking of cutlery faded, as if her entrance had frozen the air for a second. Eyes scanned her up and down, and whispers arose in the far corners, growing like sparks that quickly turned into flames of contempt. A young, nervous waiter approached hesitantly, as if unsure whether to lead her to a table or stop her from advancing. She, however, walked with silent firmness, her arms clutching the baby to her chest, as if that simple gesture were her shield against the world. There was something in her eyes, a mixture of pain, courage, and hidden knowledge, that clashed with the shallow laughter that filled the room. On the brightest side, seated at the central table, was he, the millionaire, a man accustomed to being the center of any space, with an erect posture, a cold gaze, and a magnetic presence that made even the most experienced waiter tremble when serving him. His life was written about in the newspapers, his fortune estimated at seemingly unreal figures, and his influence extended far beyond the walls of that restaurant. He was a living symbol of power, someone everyone wanted to impress and few dared to challenge. When his eyes met the young woman with the baby, a flicker of impatience crossed his face. He didn't recognize her immediately, but something in her silence seemed to defy the natural order of things. The discomfort of those present grew, as if they were witnessing a breach of the invisible rules that sustained this world of luxury. The tension grew even more intense when, ignoring glances and whispers, she chose a table near his. It was at that moment that the nervous laughter became more audible, like small stabs of sarcasm thrown at someone who dared to exist in a space where, in their eyes, they shouldn't be. The millionaire leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, observing her as if evaluating a strange object, an uncomfortable enigma. The night had barely begun, but it was already clear that this encounter would be more than just a collision of different worlds. It was the harbinger of something bigger, something that went beyond the mere presence of a single mother in a luxury restaurant. It was the prelude to a story marked by humiliation, secrets, and a silent justice that no one there dared imagine. Before that freezing night in New York, her life was already marked by much crueler winters. Not the climatic winters, but the emotional ones, the ones that pierce the soul and freeze dreams before they even blossom. She grew up in a neighborhood forgotten by the spotlight, where the facades of the houses bore cracks as deep as the families who lived within. Her father's absence was the first scar she learned to bear, and her mother, overwhelmed by the routine of low-paying jobs, always said that survival was an act of daily courage. At school, she was that girl with the same clothes, the always simple lunch, and the gaze always cast downward. Not because she was ashamed of who she was, but because she learned early on that the world didn't forgive weaknesses. It was there that the weight of exclusion began to shape her posture. The whispers, the hidden laughter, and the cruel comparisons were like small cuts that together created an invisible armor. Adolescence brought false promises. She met someone who seemed to be the way out of that narrow world. Sweet words, shared dreams, plans to escape to a better life. But she soon discovered that not all love can withstand the weight of responsibility. When she became pregnant, reality swallowed her violently. The man who had sworn to be by her side simply disappeared, leaving only bitter memories and a cowardly silence. The news spread quickly among neighbors and classmates. That foolish girl, now with a child to raise. Society's disapproving gaze became routine. At the hospital, she felt the doctor's disdain when they realized she didn't have health insurance. At the grocery store, she carried heavy bags with the same force with which she carried the judgments surrounding her. Every penny counted, every choice sacrificed, was a reminder that the world seemed to have decided her fate before she could even choose. Even so, there was one thing she never abandoned: her quiet dignity. She never begged for help. She never accepted handouts from those who only wanted to reinforce their inferiority. She preferred to wake before dawn and catch 2 buses to clean offices in Manhattan, rather than submit to poisoned pity. The baby had become her reason and her strength. Each smile from the child was like a beacon illuminating the darkness of her path. But behind, her resistance lurked a pain few could understand. She looked at the world and knew there was no room for someone like her at the glittering parties, boardrooms, or sophisticated restaurants. But she also carried a secret. She had a dormant talent, something she had inherited from her mother, a gift that the hard life had never managed to erase. And this gift, silent and invisible at that time, was what would soon change the course of her destiny. That young single mother, seen by many as a synonym for failure, was in fact a flame ready to ignite the cruel logic of social judgment. They didn't know it yet, but behind her strained skin and tired eyes hid someone destined not just to endure life, but to transform it irreversibly. In that luxurious restaurant, every word seemed to carry a hidden agenda. The conversations weren't just about business or politics. They were veiled battles of status, where every detail, from the wine chosen to the cut of the suit, was a declaration of power. The millionaire, as the evening's host, was accustomed to being the center of attention. His table was surrounded by businessmen, heirs, and women wearing calculated smiles, all ready to laugh at his jokes, applaud his stories, and bask in the glow of his fortune. It was amidst a round of expensive wines and scathing comments that the provocation arose. One of the guests, known for his venom disguised as charm, discreetly pointed to the young woman sitting a few tables away, with her baby in her arms. "See, even this place is now opening up to anyone," he said, chuckling softly but loudly enough for those closest to him to hear. The laughter spread to some at the table, and soon the cruel comparisons began. Did she come here thinking she could change her life in one night? Maybe she expects someone to pay her bill. The millionaire, previously oblivious, let out a cold smile. Not because he found it funny, but because his ego thrived on the opportunity to turn any situation into a spectacle. Then, somewhat defiantly, he said, "Do you want to see how predictable this all is? I bet that girl is just another dreamer who deludes herself into believing she can enter this world. And like all the others, she'll leave here marked by ridicule." The words echoed like sharp blades. The bet wasn't made in secret. On the contrary, it spread quickly through the room like an electric current. Some laughed, others looked on with discomfort, but no one dared to argue. It was as if everyone had already decided that this young woman, simple and out of place, would be the humiliating object of the evening. Meanwhile, she kept her eyes fixed on her son, oblivious, or perhaps not so much so, to the venom spreading around her. A dignified silence enveloped her, as if she were fully aware of the role they were trying to force upon her. The baby stirred in her arms, and she rocked him gently, ignoring the glares that pierced her like knives. On the other side, the guests, intoxicated by the social game, waited anxiously. The millionaire had pronounced his sentence, and now everyone awaited the scene where he would approach her, armed with cutting words, to extract from her a gesture of submission, a mistake, a tear. They didn't know that that night the humiliation they planned would be turned against them like a cruel mirror. The atmosphere was set. The young single mother pitted against the weight of collective arrogance, the table illuminated by vanity. Against the simple chair she sat in with her sleeping baby. It was the perfect stage for karma to begin its silent dance. The murmur of the room subsided as he stood. The millionaire walked with measured steps, like a predator carefully choosing its moment to strike. The guests watched every move, some eager for the spectacle, others curious to see how far the young woman's boldness would last. She, however, didn't look away when he stopped in front of her table. She held the baby tightly, as if the child were the only anchor keeping her upright amidst the ocean of hostile gazes. He stared at her in silence for a few seconds, long enough for the awkwardness to be almost unbearable. Then he leaned in slightly and spoke softly, but clearly audible to everyone. "You know this place isn't for people like you, don't you?" The ironic phrase hung in the air like a sentence. Some guests chuckled, others smiled knowingly, waiting to see the young woman back down. But she didn't back down. Her voice was firm yet soft, with an accent that didn't deny her humble origins. "I know exactly where I stand, and I know more than you know." Her answer made the room hold its breath. There was a calmness about her that belied her apparent fragility, a confidence that disarmed the cruelty disguised as charm of the man before her. The millionaire narrowed his eyes, intrigued. He was accustomed to submissive responses, lowered glances, and muttered apologies. Not this silent resistance. He tried to advance, maintaining his dominant stance. "If you've come here expecting pity, you've come to the wrong place. No one in this room will raise a hand to help you." She stared at him with a look that mixed pain and wisdom and said, "Who said I need anyone's help here?" The simple, direct sentence echoed louder than any scream. Her courage struck him unexpectedly, as if someone had broken the script of the show he thought he controlled. The baby, in her arms, opened his eyes and began to babble, oblivious to the tension that gripped the room. She rocked him gently, and the human gesture, pure and silent, cruelly exposed the superficiality of the entire room. For a moment, even the cruelest felt a discomfort they couldn't name. He, however, could not lose his role as a powerful host. He straightened his posture, smiled rehearsedly, and said loudly for all to hear, "Well, let's see how far this confidence goes." The hall erupted in whispers. The battle had begun. The room seemed to vibrate with cruel anticipation. Every eye was fixed on her, not because they cared about her pain, but because they yearned for the spectacle. The millionaire returned to his table and, with a wave of his hand, drew everyone's attention. The movement carried the weight of an order. The voices ceased, the glasses rested on the tables, and the room fell into a heavy silence. He raised his wineglass as if he were a conductor ready to begin the symphony of humiliation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his firm voice filling every corner of the restaurant, "we have an unexpected guest among us today, a young mother, So brave, she decided to bring her child to share this space with us. What a noble gesture, isn't it? The tone sounded like praise, but every syllable was laced with sarcasm. Suppressed laughter began to escape the guests, and some even clapped ironically. She kept her eyes fixed on the baby, preventing the fire in his gaze from penetrating any deeper than it already had. But with every word he said, her dignity was tested. The waiter, embarrassed, approached discreetly and whispered, "Do you want me to take you out?" She simply shook her head, with a serenity that seemed even more disturbing than a protest. The millionaire didn't stop. "Just imagine bringing a child to a business dinner. Maybe you're hoping someone here will be moved and foot the bill, or maybe a kind heart will invite you to share their fortune. Is that what you're looking for?" he said, turning directly to her. The laughter, now full-throated, echoed like arrows piercing her skin. One of the women at the head table leaned over to comment loudly enough, "Look at the audacity. She's even dressing like a real guest." Another added, "That baby will learn early what failure is." The cruelty was unstoppable, but she remained silent. Her eyes, when they finally lifted, weren't teary but steady. There was something there no one expected, a quiet strength, like someone watching a storm, knowing they carry the sun within. The baby, as if understanding the weight of the moment, grabbed her finger and smiled, a simple gesture, yet so powerful that it made some look away, embarrassed, unable to understand why. The millionaire, disturbed by the lack of tears, by the resistance that defied the logic of the spectacle, decided to deliver the final blow. He approached her table and discreetly placed a folded note next to her empty plate. "Here you go, a small contribution so you can dine without worry. After all, we all need to help those less fortunate." The venom was in the subtext, and the room erupted in ironic applause as if it were a calculated performance. In that moment, the whole world seemed to laugh at her. But what no one realized was that the real humiliation wasn't hers, it was theirs, and the silence she maintained would soon be the most lethal weapon against that man's pride. The restaurant was still intoxicated by cruel laughter when she, for the first time, broke the silence. Her eyes met his, not with anger, but with a serenity that seemed to disarm the entire act. In a calm but firm voice she said, "Funny, you talk about me as if you don't know who I am." The murmur died down almost immediately. The sentence fell like a bolt of lightning in the middle of the room, interrupting the cycle of humiliation that seemed unbreakable. The millionaire arched an eyebrow, surprised by her boldness. "Should I know?" he retorted with a sneer, trying to keep the audience on his side. But she was undeterred. She carefully placed the baby in the high chair beside the table, smoothed her simple dress with trembling but steady hands, and continued, "I know every word you said about me. I know the bet you made. I know the laughter you shared at my expense. And I also know what you hide, that secret that so many here would find more interesting than laughing at a mother with her child." The room hung in mid-air. Some guests glanced at each other. Curiously, others frowned, trying to decipher what this meant. The millionaire, for his part, felt for the first time the power structure that supported him tremble beneath his feet. "Watch your mouth, girl," he murmured, trying to mask the growing tension. But she only smiled faintly, with a serenity that hurt more than screams. "I'm not here to ask anything of you. I didn't come seeking pity or help. I'm here because I knew this night would happen. And believe me, I'm not the weakest piece at this table." Her gaze, steady as a blade, made him flinch for a brief moment, a gesture so small yet so significant that it didn't go unnoticed by the most attentive eyes in the room. The baby, oblivious to the weight of the revelations, babbled innocent sounds, as if a cruel reminder that amidst the vanity and arrogance, life followed its pure and immaculate course. The image of that young mother, proud even in the face of ridiculous taxation, began to crack the veneer of certainty that covered the millionaire. For the first time, he was no longer the one controlling the narrative, and in that moment, even though no one knew what would come next, something became clear. The story wouldn't end with her humiliation. Fate had already quietly changed hands, and the next steps would be taken by someone everyone had underestimated. The millionaire returned to the table, trying to regain control, but her serenity haunted him like a shadow that wouldn't dissipate. His practiced. Laughter no longer seemed convincing, and some guests, previously complicit in his arrogance, now exchanged curious glances, intrigued by the mystery hanging in the air. He, accustomed to dominating any room, realized he needed to uncover the truth behind this woman who had dared to challenge him in public without trembling. Between hurried sips of wine, a memory began to surface in his mind, uncomfortable as an unwanted whisper. Those eyes, there was something in them that took him back to a time he'd rather forget. Decades earlier, on a narrow street in a poor neighborhood, a girl had stared at him with the same unwavering gaze. She was still a teenager, but she already had that look that wouldn't bow to arrogance. He, young and ambitious, had taken advantage of his situation, striking a dirty deal that pushed many families into poverty. One of them was her family. At the time, her mother worked at one of the smaller companies he had mercilessly swallowed up in his rise to power. He remembered well. His wife had been fired without rights, left to fend for herself, and shortly afterward news spread that she had fallen seriously ill. As a child, she carried grocery bags and cared for her mother as best she could. The connection was now undeniable. The young woman's face before him was the same pain-stricken face of the girl who had once watched in silence as her own house crumbled. His heart raced, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something close to fear. Not the fear of losing money or reputation, but the fear of being unmasked in front of everyone for what he had always tried to bury. He approached her again, this time without the initial arrogance, and whispered to her, "Are you her daughter?" She didn't look away. She simply nodded with the calm of someone who carries the truth as a shield. The revelation hit him full force. She was no longer an intruder trying to climb ladders that didn't belong to her. He was the living embodiment of the price of his fortune, the heir to the pain he himself had caused. The baby in her arms made it all the more devastating, a reminder that time had passed, but the ghosts of his choices remained. The guests didn't know the details, but they noticed the drastic change in his expression. The man who minutes before had seemed untouchable now had a haggard, almost vulnerable expression. Murmurs began to circulate. Who is she? Why does he look different? The room, which had previously vibrated with humiliation, was now filled with a hush of anticipation. He who always believed he could buy everyone's silence discovered there that some secrets can't be buried with money. They are reborn in the flesh, sitting before you and looking you in the eye, demanding a form of justice that isn't announced in courts, but in the conscience that insists on collecting its debt. That same night, after the silent confrontation that had disrupted the rhythm of the party, she stood up without another word. She picked up the baby, tucked the blanket over him, and with firm steps crossed the room. There was no scandal, no goodbye, just a heavy silence that followed her to the door. And when she left, it seemed she took something else with her, the air of superiority that dominated the place. The millionaire remained seated, immobilized, as if he'd been struck by an invisible blow. He tried to regain his composure, but his mind wouldn't listen. The wine lost its flavor. The guests' conversations sounded distant, and the flatterer's laughter now seemed false and unbearable. He realized he'd let her go without even asking her name. The girl who dared to confront him was the same girl from the past he'd rather forget, and yet he knew almost nothing about the woman he'd become. In the following days, the emptiness began to grow. In the newspapers, he read his own name plastered across headlines, celebrating yet another million-dollar contract. But for the first time, those victories held no flavor. The memory of the young mother with the baby in her arms kept returning at inopportune times. During important meetings, he saw her steady gaze upon him. At business dinners, he remembered the innocent smile of the child holding his mother's finger. He tried to discreetly search for her. He sent advisors to investigate who had been at the restaurant that night, but they found no official records in her name. It was as if she had appeared out of nowhere and disappeared in the same instant. This tormented him even more. He who controlled entire companies and had access to everyone's information couldn't find a single woman who had confronted his arrogance head-on. Her silence consumed him. Her absence was more devastating than any public accusation. He began to miss not only her, but the mirror she represented. For the first time, he questioned whether everything he had achieved was nothing more than a construction built on human ruins. And the more he thought about it, the more he remembered her serenity when she said, "I know more than you know." The nights grew long. In his glass and steel penthouse, surrounded by luxury, he found himself staring into space, wondering where that woman was and if the baby was sleeping safely. The silence of the apartment contrasted with the false laughter of the restaurant, and it was in this contrast that he understood the weight of her absence. It wasn't just longing for a mysterious figure. It was the beginning of a profound regret, of a void that no number could fill. Life, for the first time, seemed to exact a price that could not be paid in money. The following weeks revealed a side of life the millionaire had never experienced: public judgment. He no longer controlled the narrative. The looks once filled with flattery now held silent questions, and conversations surrounding his name no longer held the same reverence. The scene in the restaurant, though no one fully understood it, spread like an irresistible rumor through social circles. "Did you see how he looked in front of that woman?" they whispered at parties, in corporate hallways, at gala dinners. The confidence that had always accompanied him now seemed shattered. At a business meeting, while presenting a new multi-million-dollar project, he noticed two investors exchanging glances and chuckling quietly. They weren't laughing at the project, but at him. He felt the weight of being observed not as a symbol of power, but as a vulnerable, exposed man. This was unbearable for someone accustomed to being untouchable. Soon came the gossip columns, always eager for a downfall. One journalist wryly described how the city magnate lost his majesty because of a simple, unknown young mother. The phrase, even if written without detail, spread quickly. He tried to ignore it, but each new report seemed to carry more venom. It was as if the world was silently enjoying the idea of seeing him lose his pedestal. Little by little, his own team began to falter. Advisors avoided eye contact, employees whispered in the hallways. The empire, still financially solid, showed cracks in its most important foundation: trust. And what tormented him most was the knowledge that none of this came from rivals, but from the memory of a woman who simply stood firm in the face of his cruelty. He tried to compensate for his loss with grand gestures, donations, public speeches, appearances at charity events, but nothing could erase the shadow of what had happened. People no longer remembered the impressive numbers he had achieved, but the night he stood silently before a young mother holding a baby. The narrative had shifted, and he was now seen not as the invincible, but as the man who had lost an invisible duel to someone the entire society underestimated. Every whisper, every sidelong glance, every discreet headline acted like a hammer blow to his vanity. His downfall didn't come in court, nor in bankruptcy, but in the most painful space for him, the silent opinion of the people who had always venerated him. And this social judgment, merciless and invisible, corroded him more than any economic crisis could. That silent fall, made up of cross glances and whispers at dinner parties, opened a chasm in him that money couldn't fill. For the first time in many years, the millionaire felt the weight of being alone, not in the physical sense, always surrounded by people, but in the solitude of consciousness. Her image, with the baby in her arms, returned with every silence of the early morning, as if it were a mirror he couldn't break. In the early days, she tried to drown her guilt in work, contracts, meetings, travel. Nothing seemed to distract her heart, which was now beating erratically. Even the clink of silverware in her penthouse seemed to echo memories, the sound of cruel laughter in the restaurant, the moment she looked up and said she knew everything. Every detail recurred like an open scar. He began to revisit his own history. He sat before the immense windows of his apartment and remembered the ambitious boy he had been, willing to crush any obstacle to reach the top. He remembered the unfair contracts, the displaced families, the employees discarded like spare parts. It was as if in each memory her face appeared again, the daughter of one of those families, the direct heir to the price of his rise. This plunge into the past disarmed him. For the first time, he felt not pride in his accumulated fortune but shame. Luxury, once a symbol of victory, now seemed like a gilded prison. The smiles of those around him, once fuel for his ego, now felt like mockery. He realized he had built an empire, but he had lost the ability to see the human being around him. The transformation didn't come all at once. It was slow, painful, made of small choices. One night, he dismissed the sycophants who surrounded him and chose to walk the streets alone. He saw mothers pushing strollers, exhausted workers returning home, children playing with nothing but their imaginations. He realized that, in all these anonymous faces, there was a dignity that his fortune could never buy. His heart began to open, no longer to public applause, but to the need to make amends. He didn't know how or if he would be accepted, but he felt he needed to transform his guilt into something concrete. For the first time in a long time, he cried alone, silent tears that washed away his hardened pride. Her memory, steadfast amidst the collective contempt, became a beacon. It wasn't just attraction or curiosity. It was the knowledge that this woman represented everything he had lost over the years: truth, courage, and pure love. The same love she demonstrated in the simple act of protecting her baby. And it was in this silent recognition that the man he had never been began to emerge. Not the powerful millionaire, but someone willing to face his own abyss in search of redemption. Their reunion didn't take place in a luxurious ballroom or under the lights of a dinner filled with false applause. Life, with its silent irony, decided to bring them face to face in a very different setting: a small community library in Brooklyn, supported by donations and volunteers. He had begun visiting the place in secret, trying to distance himself from the suffocating world of business and somehow get closer to what his conscience demanded: the human, the simple, the real. It was there, among shelves of worn books and tables scarred by time, that he saw her again. She was sitting in a corner, reading a children's story to the baby, who was now babbling more energetically, clapping his hands as if understanding every word. She wore nothing luxurious, just simple clothes, but there was a serene beauty about her, intensified by her care for her son and the calm with which she inhabited that modest space. He stood at a distance, unable to move. He felt the same tightness in his chest as he had the night at the restaurant, but this time it wasn't shame, it was a mixture of regret and reverence. The scene, so simple, seemed more powerful than any speech he had ever given in his life. She noticed him. She looked up and recognized him immediately. There was no surprise, just that same steady gaze that had already stripped him of his arrogance. The silence between them was heavy, almost palpable, until she slowly closed the book, placed the baby in the stroller, and said in a low but confident voice, "Did you come looking for me, or did fate bring you here?" He took a deep breath. The words seemed stuck in his throat, but he finally managed to say, "I haven't stopped thinking about you since that night. I need to talk. I need to explain." She didn't answer right away. She knelt to adjust the blanket over the baby, and only then looked back at him. "Explaining doesn't erase the past," she said, without bitterness, but with the precision of someone who carries truths like blades. He took a step closer, more insecure than ever. "I know, but I want to start somewhere. Not to clear my name, not for others to see, but because that night showed me who I really am, and I didn't like what I saw." His voice, trembling, shattered the image of the unshakable man. For the first time, he wasn't speaking as a millionaire, but as a man. She sighed, and for a brief moment, silence fell again. The baby, unaware of the gravity of the scene, smiled at him, extending his small hands toward the stranger who watched him with teary eyes. That simple gesture shattered him inside. Their reunion wasn't marked by promises or immediate forgiveness. It was marked by a silent clash of truths. He, confronted with the humanity he'd spent his life denying, and she faced with the opportunity to decide the weight of her story. Fate had placed them there again, but what happened next was up to her. Their reunion in the library made it clear that the final choice wouldn't be his. 4. The first time the millionaire understood that he didn't control the fate of that story. It was in her hands, and she knew it. Every word he spoke sounded like a sincere attempt at reparation, but it also carried the weight of a lifetime of choices that couldn't be undone with speeches. She listened silently as the baby played with the pages of a children's book, unknowingly tearing a sheet yellowed with age. That fragile sound of paper breaking seemed to symbolize something greater, the thread of a story that could be rewritten or simply left behind. "You want me to believe you've changed?" she asked without raising her voice, but with the precision of someone who knows the value of truth. He took a deep breath, barely able to hold her gaze. "I don't want you to believe words. I want to prove it. I want to find a way to repair, to rebuild what I destroyed." Her heart, for a moment, wavered. The past weighed like chains, nights of hunger, looks of contempt, the pain of seeing her mother leave without justice. But at the same time there was a broken man, stripped of his arrogance, asking for a second chance, not as a millionaire, but as a human being. She looked at the baby. The boy smiled innocently, unaware that his mother's decision could change not only their lives, but his as well. "My son doesn't need luxury, he needs dignity. He needs to grow up in a world where people like you don't destroy families out of greed." Her voice trembled, but not with fear, with intensity. He lowered his head. "Then teach me. Allow me in some way to participate in what can still be saved." The silence stretched. She closed her eyes for a few seconds, took a deep breath and replied, "I won't forget what you did, but I can choose whether to carry it forever or to let it go, and I choose to let it go not for you but for myself and my son." It wasn't exactly forgiveness, nor exactly goodbye. It was something between them, a decision not to let the past imprison her, but also not to offer it easy absolution. He would have to live with the scar, and she with the freedom to move forward. In that instant it became clear. True justice was not in watching him fall, but in remaining standing without needing him. Dusk was falling in Brooklyn when she left the library. The sky, painted in orange hues, seemed to announce the end of a cycle. She walked slowly, the baby in the stroller smiling at the clouds, while he followed her with his gaze from the door, not daring to take another step. There were no more words to be said, no promises to be made. The silence between them was enough. She crossed the street firmly, the sound of cars mingling with the child's innocent laughter. The millionaire, standing at the entrance, put his hands in his pockets and lowered his head. The cold afternoon wind ruffled his expensive coat, but he no longer felt the weight of the fabric. He felt the weight of his own conscience. On the way, she passed a store window. For a moment, she saw a reflection of herself, a young mother, simple but lifted by the strength to carry on. She looked at her son, who was staring at her as if the whole world could fit in that moment, and smiled. It was a small smile, but full of meaning. It needed no applause, no recognition. It was the silent victory of someone who, despite everything, remained whole. He, from afar, still watched. And in that look was the bitter acceptance that, this time, he wasn't the protagonist of the story. Justice didn't come in courtrooms or spectacular falls, but in the simple fact that she left with dignity, and he remained, carrying her absence as the greatest reminder of all his mistakes. The street continued on its course. People hurried past, children ran, and the world seemed indifferent to the drama that had unfolded. But within each of them, something had changed forever. She, finally free from the weight of the past. He, prisoner of a conscience that would never let him forget. And so, without applause, without explanation, the story met its end, a silent, poetic, and profoundly human end. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments what you would do in this young mother's shoes. Your participation helps bring these thought-provoking messages to more people.